There's a country made of 10 islands where it almost never rains, where the ground used to be too dry and too empty for anyone to even live on it. Today, fewer people call it home than live in a single mid-sized city. And yet, somehow, this tiny, forgotten nation is currently going toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful countries in the world. So what happened? Stick around, because the answer is Cape Verde, and it might be the biggest underdog story you've never heard. At the 2026 World Cup, this tiny nation shocked the world, standing toe-to-toe with football giants who were never supposed to even notice them. So how does a place this small pull that off? Go back to the beginning, and it isn't pretty. The Emerald Lie. Cape Verde means the Green Cape, and sailors expect green. What the islands actually hand you is the Sahel, the dry belt that fringes the Sahara, dragged out into the middle of the Atlantic. On the flatter islands, rain adds up to fewer than 145 millimeters a year, and anything under 250 is, by definition, desert. For weeks at a stretch, a haze the locals call bruma drifts in off Africa and turns the whole sky a pale, dusty brown. The shortage runs deeper than dry fields. Fresh water here is so scarce that the country cannot drink what falls from the sky, because barely anything falls. So it drinks the ocean instead. More than 90% of the fresh water in Cape Verde now comes out of desalination plants, machines that pull the salt out of seawater so a person can survive another day. Think about what that means. A nation named for green survives by manufacturing its own water from the sea that surrounds it. So the green in the name was never a promise, it was a rumor. And that one shortage, water, quietly shaped everything that came next. The food, the work, the character of the people, and the reason so many of them would one day leave. Playing with fire and ash. If thirst is the first punishment, fire is the second. These 10 islands are not islands in the ordinary sense. They are the tops of volcanoes, mountains built up off the Atlantic floor over millions of years, with only their summits breaking the surface. The tallest one says it plainly in its name. Pico do Fogo, the peak of fire, rises 2,829 meters straight out of the sea, and it is still alive. People do not just live near it, they live inside it. On the floor of the volcano's crater sits a village called Chão das Caldeiras, where around 1,000 people farm the ash of an active volcano. In November 2014, the mountain woke up. The eruption ran for 77 days into February 2015. Lava buried roughly 3/4 of the homes, and the whole village was evacuated. Then the people came back. They rebuilt in the same crater, under the same mountain, on ground that was still warm. They stayed because the black volcanic soil is rich, and out of that ash they grow vines and make a wine they export, a wine they call the wine of fire. Now cross the water to the island of Sal, and the fire flips into its opposite. At a place called Pedra de Lume, there is a lake sitting inside the crater of a volcano that died long ago. The water there is around 27 times saltier than the sea, salty enough that you cannot sink in it. You lie back and the dead volcano holds you on the surface without any effort at all. So on these islands you can drink a wine born from live lava, and then float, weightless, in the belly of a volcano that stopped breathing centuries ago. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and send this to someone who thinks they've seen every strange place on Earth. The citadel built across the clouds. Not every island here is a flat desert. Sail to Santo Antão, the second largest, and the land stands straight up. Sharp ridges, deep canyons, valleys folded into the rock, cliffs that cut into the sky. Because the high ground catches far more rain than the flat islands, this is where Cape Verde finally turns the green its name always promised. To connect the villages stranded on those ridges, people did something that should not have been possible. By hand, stone by stone, they laid cobblestone paths across slopes so steep the road seems to defy the idea of a road, some of them more than 1,000 meters up. The classic trek starts at the rim of an old crater called Cova, over 1,000 meters above the sea, where hikers stand above the clouds and look down into a bowl of solid green, then drops on a hand-laid stone staircase into the Paul Valley, thick with mango, banana, sugarcane, and passion fruit. This is where much of the island's rum comes from. Walking here is not for the faint of heart. You climb above the cloud line, you look down into valleys that fall away under your feet, and you watch what human beings can do when they refuse to let the most extreme rock on the map keep them apart. There is no single Cape Verde. One island is a flat desert built for tourists, and a few hours away, another is a vertical green world you can only cross on foot. But the strangest thing about these islands is not the ground at all. It is that for most of history, no one stood on it. The ghosts of an empty world. Most countries begin with people already on the land, a First Nation, an ancient claim, a culture older than memory. Cape Verde does not. Before the 15th century, there is no solid evidence that anyone lived on these 10 volcanic islands at all. No native population, no tribe, no footprints. They sat empty in the Atlantic while the rest of the world filled up around them. When Portuguese navigators reached them around 1456, they found no one waiting. Sit with what that means. Every single person who calls Cape Verde home today descends from someone who arrived after that point. There is no indigenous Cape Verdean, and there never was. This is one of the very few genuinely blank pages in human geography, a place where history did not begin with evolution. It began with arrival. And here is where the story turns dark, so it has to be told plainly. Empty is not the same as harmless. The islands may have started with no one on them, but they did not stay that way by choice. The people who filled them were, in large part, brought here in chains, carried across the ocean against their will from the West African mainland. That distinction matters, and the people of these islands ask again and again that the world get it right. The land was empty, but the settling of it was not gentle. A blank page is never neutral. It only records who was holding the pen. The cursed crossroads of the Atlantic. What filled that emptiness was one of the most important and most painful crossroads in Atlantic history. It began with a town called Ribeira Grande, founded in 1462 on the island of Santiago, known today as Cidade Velha, the Old City. It was the first European colonial town built anywhere in the tropics, and its position, roughly halfway between 3 continents, made it something the world had never assembled before. It made it a marketplace for human beings. For much of the 16th and 17th centuries, this small Atlantic town was a major transit point in the transatlantic slave trade, and people passed through it on their way to lives that were chosen for them by someone else. The old pillory still stands in the square, the stone post where punishment was carried out in public. This is not a place to dramatize. It is a place to remember, which is exactly why UNESCO named it a World Heritage Site in 2009, not as a celebration, but as a site the world agreed not to forget. That wealth built on suffering made the town a target. In November 1585, the English privateer Francis Drake arrived off Santiago with a fleet of around 25 ships and roughly 2,000 men. His forces marched into Cidade Velha, met almost no resistance, and when they were done, Drake ordered the town burned to the ground. The raids kept coming, and eventually they drove the capital up the coast to Praia, where it sits to this day. So the richest port in this corner of the Atlantic was hollowed out by the same thing that made it rich. It had something worth taking. The day the sea fed, the starving survival here has sometimes come from the strangest directions. In 1968, a Spanish cargo ship called the Cabo Santa Maria ran aground off the coast of Boa Vista. She was on her usual run between the Mediterranean and South America, and her hold was full of food and luxury goods, some of it gifts bound for supporters of the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco. She grounded at the worst possible time, and that turned out to be the best possible time. Cape Verde was in the grip of famine, and people were dying of hunger on these islands. Then a ship full of food simply appeared, wrecked, on their shore. So they took it. Islanders, including children and workers brought in from other islands, spent the better part of a year hauling the cargo off the wreck, moving it inland on mules and donkeys, using a dictator's gifts to stay alive through the crisis. To understand why a wrecked ship felt like a miracle, you have to know what famine meant here. For centuries, these islands lived at the mercy of the rain, and when the rain failed, there was no soil to fall back on and no neighbor close enough to help. Drought after drought in the 20th century killed people by the tens of thousands, and there was rarely a ship coming the other way to save them. So when a hull full of food ran aground by pure accident, the sea had finally, for once, given something back instead of taking. The rusting skeleton of the Cabo Santa Maria still stands on the sand today, a hull the size of a monster, slowly eaten by salt and wind, a reminder of how thin the line here has always been between starving and surviving. The dictator's secret runway. The sea fed the islands by accident. A fascist fed them on purpose, though he never meant to. In the 1930s, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini needed a place to refuel aircraft on the long haul between Europe and South America, and his eye landed on Sal, a remote, flat, all but empty island in the middle of the ocean. According to local records, he bought the rights to build a private airport there, and after the war, in 1945, Portugal took it over. Mussolini wanted a fuel stop for his ambitions. What he actually built was the foundation of an economy. That runway on an empty desert island became the seed of an international airport, and around that airport grew the tourism that now makes up roughly a quarter of the entire Cape Verdean economy. Look at Sal today and the irony gets sharper. The very things that made this island useless for centuries, the flatness, the relentless sun, the wind that made farming almost impossible, are now the product. The endless sun draws sunseekers. The constant Atlantic wind draws surfers and kite surfers from across Europe, and the flat, salt-baked ground that could never grow a crop turned out to be perfect for a runway and a resort strip. The town of Santa Maria on Sal traded its old livelihoods of salt and fish for a new one built almost entirely on visitors. So the plane that was meant to serve a dictator ended up serving the islands he barely thought about, and the desert that starved them learned to sell its own weather. The black lung of the British Empire. Sal fueled planes. But a century earlier, another island fueled the ships that ran the world. In the 19th century, the port town of Mindelo on the island of São Vicente became one of the most important coaling stations on the planet. Its deep natural harbor, Porto Grande, was a place where steamships stopped to fill their bellies with coal before crossing the Atlantic, and the coal came mostly from the mines of Britain and Wales. The British moved in early. A coal depot opened here in 1838, the Royal Mail steamers followed in 1850, and by 1889, Nearly 2,000 ships a year were calling at Mindelo to refuel. A poor fishing settlement turned, almost overnight, into a crowded, smoke-choked harbor full of sailors, speculators, and coal dust, a black industrial lung breathing in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles from the empire it served. That boom left a mark on the place that outlasted the coal. All those foreign ships and crews turned Mindelo into the most cosmopolitan corner of the archipelago, a harbor where languages, money, and music from 3 continents mixed on the same dockside, and the town still carries that outward-looking, worldly character today. Then the world moved on. Early in the 20th century, ships traded coal for oil. Newer ports at Dakar and in the Canaries pulled the traffic away, and the steamers simply stopped coming. The black lung went quiet. If these forgotten pieces of history are new to you, hit subscribe, because the strangest facts are still ahead. The currency with a secret code. All that money left a strange fingerprint you can still read on a price tag today. The currency of Cape Verde is the escudo, and it hides a small trap for anyone who did not grow up here. Everywhere else, the dollar sign goes in front of the number. In Cape Verde, they take that same symbol and drop it into the middle of the price, where you would expect a decimal point to sit. So 10 escudos and 50 centavos is not written the way your eye expects. It is written 10, then the dollar sign, then 50. $10 50. The first time you try to pay a bill here, your brain stalls, because every price looks like it is quoting you something in a currency that does not exist. This symbol has a name, the cifrão, and it has sat in the middle of Cape Verdean prices since the escudo replaced the old currency back in 1914. There is a second surprise waiting behind that one. This is not a cheap country. The escudo is pegged firmly to the euro, at a rate fixed for decades, which keeps the money stable and pulls in European investment, but it also drags prices up toward European levels. So you can be standing on a remote Atlantic island surrounded by ocean and still pay close to what you would pay in Southern Europe for a plate of fish. The peg is a quiet piece of financial code, a habit left over from history, and it turns even a simple receipt into a small puzzle. But the real code of this country was never in its money, it was in its soul. The no-stress weapon. The cruelty of this place never managed to kill the people in it. Instead, it forged them. Out of a land so dry it has to import roughly 90% of its food, they invented a way to eat. The national dish is called Cachupa, a slow stew built from corn and several kinds of beans, whatever could be stretched to feed a family through a lean day, simmered for hours until it becomes one thing. That same scarcity built something bigger than a recipe. It built a culture the islanders call morabeza, a warmth so deep it does not translate cleanly, sitting somewhere near kindness, hospitality, and treating a stranger as if they were already family. And it did not grow out of comfort. It grew out of the opposite. On land this dry, through famine after famine, no family could survive alone, so sharing stopped being a courtesy and became a survival strategy. It is genuinely considered rude here to eat in public without offering food to the people around you, because once, that instinct was the difference between a community that made it and one that did not. You can hear the same fusion in the way people talk. On islands with no native population, a new people made themselves, blending Portuguese settlers and West Africans into something genuinely new. And out of that blend came their own language, Creole or Crioulo, often described as Portuguese words resting on an African frame. Portuguese is still the official language written on the forms, but Crioulo is the one spoken at the table, in the lullabies and the arguments and the jokes. When the deepest language of a people is one they built themselves, the identity is not borrowed, it is theirs. The famous island motto, "No stress," is not laziness. It is a calm hammered out of disaster. The night guard of the iron shells. That same instinct to protect life shows up on the darkest beaches, in the middle of the night. The coast of Boa Vista is one of the 3 most important nesting sites in the world for the loggerhead sea turtle. On black, wind-scoured sand, in the dark, one of the planet's great animal events happens almost unwatched, and around it a quiet war is being fought. A country with almost no resources has thrown real technology at protecting these animals. Drones, trained dogs, and night patrols work the beaches through the blowing sand, guarding the nests against poachers who once took the turtles for meat. And it worked. On some of these beaches, the number of nests has risen dramatically over the past few decades. Somewhere along the way, a poor nation decided these creatures were worth more alive on the sand than sold at a market, and then spent its scarce resources proving it. This country learned to guard what it loves. What it could not do was stop its own people from leaving. The oasis of peace. Here is the fact that quietly destroys the assumption most outsiders arrive with. Cape Verde has no oil. It has no valuable minerals. It has almost no farmland. By the usual rules, a place like this ends up poor, unstable, or both. Instead, since it won its independence in 1975, Cape Verde has built one of the most stable and free democracies on the entire African continent. Power passes peacefully from one elected government to the next, election after election. Its score on the Human Development Index sits near the top of the continent. Its crime rate is low enough to surprise people who assume the worst. This is a real oasis, not a mirage, and it stands as living proof of a single idea. The true strength of a nation was never buried in the ground beneath it. It was in the people who stayed, and in the institutions they chose to build. And nowhere did that human strength show more clearly than on a football pitch in 2026. The Aceh with its own name, Cape Verde, carries one sorrowful fact of arithmetic. There are more Cape Verdeans living outside the islands than on them. Somewhere between 3 and 4 times as many, driven off the land generation after generation by drought and hunger. That scattering left a permanent ache in the culture, a homesickness so specific it has its own word, saudade, and it runs straight through the country's music, its lyrics, its whole emotional register. For most of this country's history, that ache looked like nothing but loss. A homeland slowly emptying itself out, one boat and one plane at a time. But you already know what that same scattering built, generations later, on a football pitch in 2026. The children who grew up somewhere else came back anyway. Have you ever felt that pull toward a homeland you had to leave? Tell us below. The symphony born from shackles. The last answer these islands give to their own history is the loudest one. The people of Cape Verde took the memory of slavery and turned it into something no one can take back: music, and the dance that comes with it. Listen to a rhythm called Batuco. It was built by African women on these islands under a specific cruelty. When the colonial authorities and the church banned drums, fearing them as instruments of rebellion, the women refused to go silent. They bound cloth into tight bundles, held them between their thighs, and beat out rhythm on the fabric, turning a banned instrument into one no one could confiscate. Batuco and its cousin Funana were treated as obscene and forbidden for generations, and today they are alive and celebrated. That same instinct gave the country the sound the world finally learned. The ache of everyone who left has a name here, saudade, and it pours into a slow, mourning style of song called Morna, which UNESCO added to its list of the intangible heritage of humanity in 2019. And it had a voice. Cesaria Evora, the barefoot diva who sang on stage without shoes in solidarity with the poor women of her country, carried that longing to people who had never heard of Cape Verde, won a Grammy in 2003, and gave her name to the airport many travelers now read the moment they land. You can hear where all of it leads at the Carnival of Mindelo, a flood of color and sound and fire that outsiders sometimes call the Rio de Janeiro of Africa. It is the proof written in rhythm. Chains can bind a body, but they never once managed to silence the hunger for freedom in the soul of the people here. So go back to where this started. 10 islands, 500,000 people, land so harsh it stayed empty for most of human history. No oil, no minerals, barely any rain. By every normal measure, this country should have nothing to offer the world. That's the answer to the question we opened with. How does a nation this small end up standing toe-to-toe with giants? It was never luck, and it wasn't one lucky generation of footballers. It's the same thing that's carried these islands through every disaster history threw at them. Cape Verde has spent 500 years turning not enough into somehow enough. A team of scattered children refusing to back down on a World Cup pitch wasn't the exception. It was just the latest proof. The islands were handed almost nothing. The people made nearly everything. Maybe that's the question Cape Verde leaves in your chest. How much of what you call strength was actually built for you by someone else out of nothing at all?